So yeah, thanks to everyone, both in person and virtually. We've got some folks still tuning in on Zoom, some from our Southwest Research Institute colleagues as well. So glad you're all here. Very happy to have Dr. Kevin Genestreti with us here as well. I've got quite the intro lined up here for him as well. But the first introduction point being that it's a miracle he's here based on the sound of the frozen Honda Civic episode. So he may mention that in the talk, I mean, I'll leave that up to him. But we're glad he's here. And my name is Jason Schuster, by the way, assistant research scientist here at UNH. And Kevin and I go way back to undergrad, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
Many of the professors, either here at UNH, either on Zoom or in this room, Roy for classical mechanics, Mark Lassard for E&M, and many others. So we're glad to.
So if I say anything wrong, you really have yourselves to blame.
There you go. That's right. Upon graduating there, so Kevin got his PhD from the joint UTSA and SwRI program, Southwest Research Institute in Texas, where he worked with Stephen Fuselier, Jim Birch, Jerry Goldstein, working on HPCA and FBI calibration, among other reconnection related topics. He continued to study reconnection research in the tail from 2016 to 2018 in Austria, specifically, I believe, with Rumi Nakamura. After that, returned to UNH as a research scientist. And then in 2019 to the present moment, Kevin is back with Southwest at the New Hampshire campus of Southwest Research Institute, of course. And he is now the deputy PI of the MMS mission, which makes him uniquely qualified to share with us a decade summary of exciting MMS results, particularly focused on the electron diffusion region. So with that, take it away, Kevin.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll say a summary of the electron diffusion region and a highly biased one towards my particular interest at that. Just before I get going, a lot of this this work that I'm about to share here is just ripped wholesale from a review paper that we just submitted to Space Science Reviews. So I just want to thank the co-authors listed there, in particular Rumi Nakamura, for helping get that paper out. So just an outline, I'll start with sort of a so what, who cares of magnetic reconnection. A lot of the reason that we care about magnetic reconnection is because it has the potential to impact a plasma system at the scale of the whole system. Then I'll sort of step through the history of investigating the physics of reconnection with in situ data, starting with the earliest observations of fluid scale signatures of reconnection, then ion scale signatures, and finally MMS electron scale signatures and physics of reconnection. The meat of this talk is in the next bullet there, the characteristics of the electron diffusion region. I'm going to compare theories and models and observations for electron diffusion regions and the physics therein that enables magnetic reconnection, and then step through how those physical processes differ depending on the background conditions of the reconnecting plasma. Then I'm going to try and take it basically full loop, after progressively zooming in and in and in to the electron diffusion region. I'm going to try and then close the loop and step back out to see how the physics that we've learned about the EDR impacts the larger system scale dynamics driven by reconnection. And most of what I'm going to be doing there is identifying unanswered questions. Now, there are many various acronyms assigned to signatures in many various data sets to describe impulsive energy release phenomenon throughout space and in lab plasmas that are associated or thought to be associated with reconnection. Some examples are, geomagnetic storms at Earth, magnetic storms in planetary magnetospheres and aurora, CMEs and flares from reconnection in the solar corona. There's possible that that microscopic sort of nano reconnection in the corona might also be responsible for the heating. There are crashes in lab plasma containment devices. There's gamma ray bursts from pulsars, black hole accretion disks. Really, reconnection is just a fundamental process that transfers energy in a plasma from the magnetic field to the particles. And so it's sort of no surprise really that reconnection happens, in all of these various plasma environments. Ultimately, the vast majority of the visible matter in the universe is made of particularly magnetized plasma. And often quite a lot of energy is stored in the magnetic field. And then whenever you get a twisted up magnetic field in a plasma, that energy can be released through reconnection. So let's sort of punch in on the particular case of Earth's magnetosphere. Everywhere in the universe that reconnection occurs, it's doing a few things. First of all, it's changing the topology of a magnetic boundary. It's interconnecting the magnetic fields from either side of a current sheet. It's accelerating the plasma with energy released from the magnetic field. And then it's convecting away in these accelerated jets of plasma, the reconnected magnetic flux. So here, for instance, at Earth, you have, when the interplanetary magnetic field is southward, you have two reconnection sites, say, one at the low latitude magnetopause and one in the magnetotail. And the dynamics that are essentially enabled and sustained by those two cases of reconnection drive the Dungy cycle, or just the global scale redistribution of mass, energy, and magnetic flux throughout the whole of geospace. Of course, those large-scale dynamics are enabled by relatively microscopic processes. I forget, I used to have stored in my memory the ratio of the volume of the magnetosphere that's occupied by magnetic reconnection diffusion regions. It's very minuscule. It's 10 to the minus I don't know, 26 or something like that. Percent of the volume of the magnetosphere is occupied by diffusion regions. But still, the processes that happen within them are sufficient to enable these global scale dynamics. So now I'll sort of step through. I want to motivate basically the need for MMS at the time that MMS was launched. So I'm going to step through some of the history of how we came to accept that reconnection was happening in the magnetosphere, and with each sort of progressive decade, what was yet unknown. Observations of reconnection in the magnetosphere in situ started in the 60s or so. For example, at the magnetopause, Poshman and Sonera are two huge names. They really made sort of the first detections of reconnection there. The signatures they use to identify reconnection are fast jets to the north and south, going either way from more or less the equator. And those jets carried with them magnetic field that crossed the magnetopause. So it showed that the field from the magnetosphere was interconnected with the field from the shot solar wind. And through all of this, they developed a whole bunch of tools that are still standardly used to this day to analyze reconnection. Now, at the same time in the magnetotail, Ed Hones basically miraculously was deriving the entire tail substorm cycle shown here in the middle from single point spacecraft plasma and magnetic field data. And so what he had noticed was periodically the spacecraft would initially be in the plasma sheet, out of the plasma sheet, and then back in a much more active plasma sheet with fast convective flows. And so what he took that to mean was, again, periodically, the plasma sheet would become thin. There would be some local pinch in the current sheet where magnetic reconnection would be initiated. And then here, the subsequent change in topology and jetting essentially reconfigures the whole magnetotail. But reconnection was certainly not well accepted. Our field's only Nobel Prize winner, I pulled this from a 1976 paper. There is a one-sentence abstract that reads, "It is shown that frozen-in magnetic field lines and magnetic field line reconnection are unnecessary and often misleading concepts. And so ultimately, the point was that we could have these remote signatures of reconnection, but what we really needed to understand is how ideal MHD was violated, the kinetic physics that enables reconnection. So I'll get into that more, why you need to violate ideal MHD. So here's my little cartoon of reconnection. Now, in order for two sheared magnetic fields to slip through a plasma current sheet, meet, merge, and then be ejected, you need the field to slip through the plasma. So you need to break the frozen-in condition. The plasma and field motions have to be decoupled. And you can write that this way, as a curl of an electric field in the frame of the plasma. Ampere's law, basically, you can rewrite that as in the plasma frame, the magnetic field is time varying. So there's some slippage of the plasma and magnetic field. Now, question is, how do you violate this term? And generalized Ohm's law here gives you a few options. So on the left of the statement of equivalence is the ideal MHD field. And then there are various terms here. First is the basically just the magnetic force term, the Hall force, J cross B. This is the force that you get from decoupled perpendicular motion of ions and electrons. Then there are two forces associated with the electrons here. The first is the electron pressure force, the divergence of the electron pressure tensor. And then the electron inertial force, which has a time varying term and a spatial varying term. And then this final term here is some sort of witchcraft in a collision with plasma, since strictly speaking, there is no resistance without collisions, but some people will, this term is used in resistive MHD, for instance, to account for all of the various physics they can't capture. It's sometimes used in kinetic physics if you separate varying and DC fields and forces.
Clarifying question. Do you have similar terms for the ions in terms of the pressure force and inertial force, or does that not work because the electrons are able to neutralize what the ions are doing on that scale?
Yeah, this is this is the generalized Ohm's law. This is the written for the electron momentum equation.
Okay.
You'll have similar terms if you write the ion momentum equation. Basically, the reason for writing it, I will only ever in this presentation write and refer to generalized Ohm's law in the electron momentum form here. Mostly because in order for reconnection to happen, you need all of the species motions decoupled from that of the magnetic field, and the hardest ones to get are the electrons. So if you get electron demagnetization, you're sure to have all other heavier species demagnetized. So
Yeah,
this is sort of what clinches the physics.
yeah, I think in that derivation, there's the term with the ion pressure tensor term, and it's divided by 1 over the mass ratio or something. So for the ion pressure tensor piece just doesn't contribute there. But I have one other question, Kevin. So we've definitely seen that, equation, the curl of E plus V cross B deviating from 0, which then translates to this changing magnetic field in the plasma frame. It does seem like that's a pretty generic statement to just say that dBT or dB by dt is not 0, could just mean the field is changing in some kind of non-trivial fashion. But is it just that's differing from like the plasma frame, I guess, or is there an intuition you have for why that condition makes sense, I guess? Like, is that always reconnection, or is it just some, I guess like you said, field line merging, maybe not reconnection yet? It's just some sort of merging can happen, or slippage, you said, I think.
The necessary and sufficient condition for reconnection is to have a non-zero electric field out of the plane here, and also a violation, have that electric field set up in such a way that it violates the frozen-in condition in a region of space where two sheared magnetic fields are in contact with each other. The only thing that plasma configuration I just described can do is reconnect.
Right, that
Assuming
that
it's
top
not-
line is basically Faraday's law.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which, it's a necessary condition to have changing a non-zero dBdt, but
Yeah.
that's not sufficient.
Okay.
All right, well, let's go ahead here. Now how do you break the frozen in condition? And like I was just saying, yeah, you do it, sort of separately depending on the, relevant scale size of the, particle species you're talking about. So since the very earliest days of, theorizing about reconnection, it was known that the decoupling of field and plasma particles had to be a sort of multi-stage, multi-step process. And so this is an illustration from a SwRI paper, a chapter of a book, I think. Here he's showing what we would now call the ion diffusion region. This is the region where, of all of the terms I just wrote in the generalized Ohm's law, the Hall term dominates. So it's the magnetic force term that dominates. You have differential motions of your ions and electrons, your ions being decoupled from the field and your electrons being coupled to the field. And then I clipped this sentence from the paper, which I think was the only description therein of the electron fusion, which says, basically inflowing electrons are brought to rest on the order of an electron inertial length or maybe the gyro radius. And so that would be this magical box here in the center, the EDR. But there were a few predictions here. First of all, once you have charge separations, you have electric fields that result from the charge separations, and you have current systems that set themselves up to neutralize that charge imbalance. And so that current system is called the Hall current system. It's this sort of four-way current loop. These current loops close far downstream. Inflowing electrons are brought in to try and balance out the net positive charge in the current sheet, and then the electrons are subsequently ejected faster than the ions in the outflow direction. Each of these current loops leads to some right-hand rule out of this plane magnetic field, and you wind up with this sort of quadrupolar structure of the out of plane magnetic field. And so those exact signatures were the first that were used to identify the ion diffusion region, the ion kinetic physics that enables reconnection. And so I'm not going to spend too long on these rather complicated diagrams, but suffice it to say that they used both signatures of the Hall currents and the resulting quadrupolar magnetic fields to identify ion diffusion regions. This was first done with single point data. There is a Suginobu Nagai paper using geotail, which was instrumental for discovering a lot of this physics. And then there's a paper by Maria Oroset using winds, maybe. Yeah. But really it was clustered that unfortunately I didn't give a slide to that was huge in what it added was multi-point data to sort of reveal how the ion scale physics works. But anyway, so what was really well known at the turn of the millennium was the role of Hall physics in reconnection. So it was very well understood that if you want your reconnection to go realistically fast, the bare minimum of generalized Ohm's law that you need to capture is the Hall term, or there's also some option to do localized resistance and resistive MHD. But sort of the conclusion of the GEM challenge type studies were basically that it was the ion kinetics rather than the electron kinetic behavior that were instrumental in setting the fast reconnection rate. But the fact remains that without the electron kinetics, the reconnection rate is exactly zero. Unless the electrons decouple from the field, you can't have reconnection. So the EDR is needed for reconnection, but as these studies show, perhaps it's not. The electron physics may not be so important for setting the rate of field line merging. And one additional thing to point out here is in the ion diffusion region, I mentioned the predominant force that balances your electric field is the Hall force, the J cross B force. Just here from basic mathematics, you see that the Hall force is incapable of doing work on the plasma. And so you need to look at additional terms in generalized Ohm's law if you want to understand how the plasma is gaining energy. So MMS was derived basically as the definitive experiment to determine the causes of reconnection. And I'll just skim through this here. The sort of key advances are, we had higher time resolution and higher spatial resolution of the particle data, higher spatial resolution of the field data. That was needed to resolve the much smaller electron diffusion region. And we also had 3D electric field measurements on each spacecraft, which none of the previously mentioned missions had. So we could actually see both the electron forces that balance the reconnection electric field and how the fields are set up such that there is a violation of the frozen-in condition. And that's sort of the holy grail to understand, to address this point here, the causes of reconnection. This isn't super necessary, but a few years ago, I spent a really long time making this slide. So I'd like to show it to justify the time investment. Now, this is going to run through here. This is just sort of a comparison of MMS versus cluster. So basically, MMS used a lot of the architecture in terms of data analysis that cluster used. Both were for spacecraft missions defining the volume. So we had a lot of the same analysis techniques for separating time and spatial variations, analyzing gradients, basic sort of physical calculations that type of spacecraft configuration goes with. Now, the key difference is that the MMS configuration is much, much smaller, and particularly the plasma particle instruments make measurements much, much faster. So on the left here, I think these are roughly at least to scale. The blue line indicates the sort of rough separations between the 4 cluster probes. The yellow lines, solid and dotted, indicate the range of ion inertial scales you'll get in and around the magnetosphere. And then really small on the bottom are is the lowest separation between the MMS probes and the electron inertial scales. Now this animation is going to run here, showing on the top the real-time seconds elapsed. Within that time, the number of ion distributions that cluster made, and then finally the number of distribution functions that MMS made, I think probably for the electrons. So what kind of surprised me is just how quickly we're scanning 3D distribution functions. I mean, these are this is an incredibly dense data set. Anyways, it really didn't serve too much of a purpose.
I might have just given that.
I was really hoping I would find some purpose in talking through that slide, but it didn't.
What were you fascinating when you made that?
What was that count?
Let's move on. I can't waste any more time on that slide.
What was it counting? How many?
FPI, number of FPI.
How many electron distribution functions you were getting?
I'm glad to see it actually caused more confusion than it did answer questions. Whatever. Anyways, I'll get to more details on this, but basically the universal thing that electron diffusion regions do is sort of what I described earlier. There are electron kinetic forces that balance the reconnection electric field and violate the frozen-in condition at a point where 2 magnetic fields meet, and those are the necessary and sufficient conditions for reconnection. However, the details of the fields and forces there and the structure of the EDR and also the resulting energy conversion are dependent on the conditions of the plasma in which reconnection is occurring. So once sort of the rough infrastructure of MMS was in place, it was decided that MMS would target essentially two flavors of reconnection. One is occurring at Earth's magnetopause here, and the other in the cross-tail current sheet out here. Those typical locations for those two flavors of reconnection are at different radial distances, so we had two mission phases to target each of those two regions. Now, the magnetopause campaign here looks at reconnection between asymmetric plasmas. Those can be two plasmas with different densities, different temperatures. They can have different magnetic fields. And also at the magnetopause, you can have reconnection between plasmas with nearly antiparallel magnetic fields with very high magnetic shear, or a so-called guide field reconnection where the magnetic shear is less than 180 degrees. In the magnetotail, you have much more simple type of reconnection. It's typically closer to antiparallel. And the plasmas on either side of your current sheet are alike. So you have symmetric antiparallel reconnection. Now I'll get into the MMS results here. So I'm going to start with magnetotail reconnection, the sort of simpler flavor, symmetric and antiparallel. How the
Just a moment. We've intermission.
and then go through how the physics of the EDR changes if you introduce asymmetries in your reconnecting plasmas, and what happens if you start reducing the magnetic shear from 180 degrees and have sort of guide field type reconnection. And then I'll get to the back portion of this. So here are some cartoons. Now in the EDR, there are 2 points that I'll refer to. One is a point defined by the magnetic field, is called the X point. In this plane here, which is commonly L and N, as you can see here, N being normal to the current sheet, L being the sort of outflow direction or the direction of the shared magnetic fields. The X point is where the L and N components of your magnetic field vanish. And then there's also an electron flow stagnation point, SE point, where the in-plane components of your electron bulk flow vanish. And so for symmetric and anti-parallel reconnection, both of those points coincide. They are one and the same. The X point and flow stagnation point sit right on top of each other. Now, at the edges of the EDR, you have a slowing down of your inflowing electrons until that flow eventually vanishes at the X and flow stagnation points. And then as you move further away tangential to the current sheet, you have the progressive acceleration of your outflow. And so since the, so we want to ask what the forces are that balance the reconnection electric field force. Well, at the X point here, since you have a vanishing in plane flow, unless the reconnection is strongly three-dimensional, basically that rules out at all the ability of the electron inertial force to balance your reconnection electric field. The opposite is true around the edges of the EDR, where the slowing down of the inflow and the acceleration of your outflow lead to a predominance of the inertial force. But for the most part, I'm just going to focus on what happens around the X and stagnation points. Now, I'm also, for the most part, unless otherwise specified, going to focus on cases where the reconnection is quasi two-dimensional. So all terms related to out-of-plane gradients in the direction of the current vanish or are exceedingly negligibly small, and also steady-state reconnection where all time derivative terms vanish. So anyways, in that case here, again, I was saying the inertial force vanishes at the X point, in the asymmetric, symmetric anti-parallel case. Also, you are left with, because of the symmetry, no available gradients in the, gyrotropic electron pressure, that might support your reconnection electric field. So really, if you write out your generalized Ohm's law, it can be reduced substantially to essentially two terms here that are just only related to non-gyrotropic electron pressure tensor forces. Now in the EDR, theory went that these non-gyrotropic electron pressure forces were basically the result of Spicer type electron motions. That's when your current sheet becomes sufficiently thin, the electrons sort of bounce back and forth, doing this serpentine figure 8 motion around the magnetic field reversal. And around the X line where the magnetic field is 0, the electrons are trapped in the EDR, and they do these back and forth bounce motions through the reconnection electric field, just progressively gaining energy. That results in distribution functions that are sort of striated. I don't know if it's really coming out here, but you see these individual stripes. Basically, that corresponds to electrons that have done one bounce, picked up some certain amount of energy. Then again, next one, done another bounce, picked up another quantum of energy, and so on and so forth. And that's a signature of very steady, also pretty much two-dimensional reconnection. And then eventually, either through just the sufficient energy gain to just escape, or some magnetic deflection, these electrons are bumped either to the left or to the right out into the exhaust. Now there's the dream MMS event here in the tail. Essentially, it's kind of nice that we didn't start with the magneto tail and instead started with the magnetopause, because essentially this event you could run through the list and it basically confirmed everything here looked more or less as much like the simple cartoon that you could possibly dream. You had essentially all of those physical processes that were readily identifiable in the MMS data. So first of all, we had a really nice, very clear identification of the reconnection electric field that scaled with the background plasma conditions, just sort of exactly the way that we knew a typical reconnection electric field should. And if you try to, studies, Rumi Nakamura and Jan Egdal's studies looked at the forces that balance that of the reconnection electric field, and just like expected, found that it was around the X line, the divergence of the non-gyrotropic electron pressure. If you look at the distribution functions, again, you see these striated, this striated pattern here. If you calculate the difference in energy between each of these discrete bands, you can actually derive the strength of the reconnection electric field and the rate. And that's exactly what we found looking at the, well, more or less what we found looking at the data from the electric field probes. And so all of this just paints a really nice and simple picture here of reconnection being at the electron scale anyways, fairly steady, quasi two-dimensional, and very much in an equilibrium state with the surrounding larger scale environment, such that all of these quantities scale nicely with each other and sort of work out exactly like how you think they should. Potentially not the most interesting case, but there's. Now I'll get into what happens when you change the plasma conditions on either side of your current sheet. You have asymmetric reconnection. Can I get a time check though?
Yeah, you have another like half hour or so.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm probably a bit more
It's
than
4:04.
halfway through, so. Now, once you introduce asymmetries either in the plasma conditions or the magnetic field, you need not have co-located X and flow stagnation lines. So you can see in the drawing here, basically there's one point, the X line where the in-plane magnetic field vanishes, but the flow has not stagnated, so there is net flow. And then another point, the flow stagnation point, where the opposite is true. And so the key differences here between asymmetric and symmetric reconnection are basically, you have a non-zero magnetic field at your flow stagnation point, and you have a non-vanishing flow at your X point. And so unlike the symmetric case, you can have a non-vanishing electron inertial force balancing the reconnection electric field at your X point. And you can have a non-vanishing gradient of the gyrotropic pressure at your X point. It's not just the energy conversion rate doesn't scale so simply with the reconnection rate. It also scales with the gradient of the gyrotropic pressure. So which goes as the level of asymmetry between the plasmas.
Kevin, one question there, and this might be a little bit in the weeds, but when we talk about, it said it's still on, there. So when we talk about the energy conversion as opposed to say, like, I guess dissipation, I don't necessarily use these terms interchangeably at times in the field, but I guess there's that subtlety between J dot E plus BE cross B and then J dot E plus BI cross B. I think there's a sit-down paper just sort of talking about how those terms can basically be the same. That is to say, like in the ion rest frame versus the electron rest frame, this measure of energy conversion can look equivalent. I don't know if that, I guess specifically for asymmetric reconnection, does that throw things off a little bit in the diagram, or it's still?
No, that's simply a result of requiring quasi-neutrality, that you can write the J dot E prime in whatever the convective frame of whatever species you want.
Yeah.
And it's the same.
Right, as long as quasi-neutrality holds. So I guess that's violated though in often cases here, so maybe it wouldn't even hold anyway.
The plasma is very quasi-neutral. It's like 1 part in a billion or something like that, the charge imbalance. But also, strictly speaking, it's not possible to have irreversible. I mean, you threw dissipation out there. I've eliminated that from my vocabulary. It's strictly speaking not possible to have irreversible energy conversion in the absence of collisions. I haven't kept up with Paul Kasik's work. Maybe he's overthrown that portion of thermodynamics, but
Not yet.
anyways, now here's what asymmetric anti-parallel reconnection looks like in the MMS data. So from the top to bottom, in blue, green, red, meaning LMN, and again, L is the jet direction, N is the normal to the current sheet direction, M is out of the plane. You have the magnetic field vector, the current density, the electric field, the component of the electric field expected to be the reconnection electric field component, the parallel to the magnetic field component of the electric field, and then the energy conversion rate in the rest frame of the electrons. So what you can see here is at the X point, where your magnetic field vanishes, is displaced from the electron stagnation point, where the N and L components of your electron flow vanish. At your X point, there is a non-vanishing electron flow, meaning that the electrons and ions are just pushing straight across the magnetopause from the heavier sheath into the magnetosphere. And there is a large sunward electric field pointed all the way across the magnetopause from the magnetosphere all the way into the sheath inflow, just upstream of the X line. And that is a result of the asymmetry 2 different ways. One is from the gradient of the pressure across the magnetopause, and the other is from the charge separation that you get basically because the sheath ions are able to push further across the magnetopause than the electrons are. So that's the strong electric field that then contributes, in addition to the reconnection electric field to your energy conversion rate. Yep, there's non-gyrotropic electrons, and have been very few cases where we can really do the really separate the force terms and generalized Ohm's law and really pull out the non-gyrotropic pressure force, but the non-gyrotropic pressure force is certainly in the mix. Now here's a paper from Roy in 2016. Rather than do the full decomposition of the force terms, what he's doing is just dotting the pressure gradient, pressure divergence force into the current and the electron inertial force into the current, and just seeing how those two terms are contributing to the overall energy conversion. And I won't stay on this too long, but essentially what he finds is at the X line, sort of like you expect, there's a little more inertial force poking in this blue line. And then at the electron stagnation, pretty much everything is from the divergence of the electron pressure. But unlike the models, and it could be just because here we have, you know, in the MMS data, obviously we have the real mass separation, the ion electron mass ratio of the universe. We have a much larger, much smaller, contribution from the electron inertia than previously thought. So basically everywhere, there are some smaller regions where the inertial force may become non-negligible, but basically everywhere the work is being done by the electron pressure. Now things change up a bit when you introduce a guide field. So the sort of key difference that introducing a guide field does is at the X point, you have a non-vanishing magnetic field. And just like everywhere in space, that magnetic field is magnetizing particles. Demagnetization is a requirement for that meandering motion that leads to non-gyrotropies, that leads to the non-gyrotropic pressure force. And so the larger your guide field, the more you might expect that physics to be repressed or suppressed, sorry. The guide field sort of becomes more significant when those when those types of motions are suppressed, and that happens when the gyro radius about the guide field is smaller than the length of a meandering orbit. And so if you look at these steady state and two-dimensional models of reconnection, which is again very simplified, you find basically still you need the only available force term to give you reconnection is the non-gyrotropic pressure force. So the only thing that this current sheet can do is just shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink until the current sheet thickness is smaller than the orbit of a meandering Spicer type orbit. And then again, just like this metric case, you have these meandering electrons that give you pressure non-gyrotropy and enable reconnection. So for me, at least, this is where these sort of results get more interesting because we've never seen anything like that in the MMS data. And so I'll tell you here, what we do see is the models basically, the 2D steady state models will tell you that you just need pressure non-gyrotropy, and the only way to get it is just keep shrinking your current sheet until it's so thin that you can support electron meandering. And that's not at all what we see in the MMS data. What we see is basically the electron current sheet remains more or less the same thickness. It scales with the electron inertial length. And essentially, the stronger your guide field, the less pronounced your non-gyrotropy is, until we have a small collection of very strong guide field events where there's no evidence for pressure non-gyrotropy at all. So the conclusion that you draw from that is that in these cases, the assumptions of your models are wrong. Namely, that the reconnection is either or neither steady state or quasi two-dimensional. And so these are results from a couple papers here. We broke down the force balance and showed that Actually, both of those things were true. This is an example of guide field reconnection at the magnetopause. And in order to describe the forces that were balancing the reconnection electric field, you needed strongly three-dimensional electron pressure gradients, and you needed strongly time-varying energy densities in your magnetic field and particles. I'll get back to sort of the implications of that in a slide or so. Now, just sort of summarizing this here, this is a plot, sort of cartoon diagrams of the magnetic field, the stagnation point, and the X point on the top. Below that are the time series, sort of tried to align with these characteristics here, the time series of the energy conversion rate. And then below that are the velocity distribution functions of the electrons that are carrying the current, that are carrying the reconnecting current. So for the anti-parallel case here, you have everything strongly perpendicular. You have strongly non-gyrotropic electrons meandering. In the asymmetric case, you have separation between your X and stagnation points. And then as you add a guide field, these perpendicular dynamics start vanishing, and instead you start favoring parallel dynamics. So instead of meandering electrons, you only really get a very small non-gyrotropy that's visible for superthermal electrons. And instead, basically what you get is electrons just streaming straight along the magnetic field. And for the strongest guide field cases, again, we see no evidence for non-gyrotropy, and just everything essentially becomes parallel. But it would be very good. I think what we need to do is do this analysis for more events to figure out whether this is actually a common feature of guide field reconnection. It would be a bit strange if so. It could have some interesting implications, which I'll describe here. Basically, what I mean, so this is the implications of violating the typical assumptions of your models, which is either you have a strongly three-dimensional current sheet or a strongly time-varying reconnection. Strongly three-dimensional, for instance, I'll throw out just a specific example. You have an electron scale gradient along your X-line of the electron pressure, or time varying, some time variation of the physics controlling the supporting the reconnection electric field on the time scales of the electrons. So either one of those tells you that the reconnection has to be localized either in time or space substantially. These are, if a gradient or time variation is discernible with MMS, that means it's a very small scale. It's on the order of the electron inertial length. So of course, reconnection in reality, like all things, is three-dimensional and time varying. But the curiosity is how you go from reconnection that has evidence for localization at the electron scale to zooming all the way back out to my initial slides, the global scale impacts of reconnection that we've known for half a century, which is the sort of global convection of the magnetosphere, and the generation of large scale jets and the topology change. So we have one example of what might cause localization in space or time at the electron scale. Here's an example from a 2022 paper. Basically, the idea is if you set up two plasmas with exactly anti-parallel magnetic fields, the most efficient orientation for reconnection is just an X-line straight across, so that in the plane of the reconnection, you have 180 degrees of magnetic shear. So that's the orientation of reconnection that maximizes your available magnetic energy. So reconnection there is the most efficient that it could possibly be. If you wind up with reconnection in a somewhat suboptimal orientation, then you won't be able to process all of the available energy. And so what we found in this 2022 paper is that some of the signatures of electron scale fluctuations in EDRs were associated with rather than having a reconnection that is set up in a suboptimal way. Essentially, what you're just doing is throwing fields and plasmas at the magnetopause that are varying faster in time than the reconnection can adjust itself. And so, there's turbulence in the magnetosheath. The sheath field is not constant either in time or space. And what this paper supposed was that it was those spatial and temporal fluctuations in the inflow conditions that were basically forcing this localization and time variation in the reconnection. And so here's a model. Basically, we threw a current sheet at the magnetopause. We had a magnetopause in a 3D pick run that we ran long enough with steady conditions, so that this is a plot of BZ in the LN plane. This reversal from negative to positive polarity in BZ, this is the reconnected magnetic field. So an X line looks like a reversal in the reconnected magnetic field. And just from running the magnetopause for long enough, you have this primary X line that sets itself up. And then once this magnetic field rotation hits the magnetopause, you see the X line splinters into these localized secondary X lines that develop it basically in a way to try and steer your reconnection toward the most optimal configuration. And then those secondary X lines are sort of shed away until the X line sort of adjusts itself. But ultimately, we're a bit limited in understanding the broader context of that physics. So far, most of the MMS mission has been spent in a very tight electron scale tetrahedron. I've identified two major open questions here. On the left, this question is going to be addressed with a campaign, with an MMS campaign that's underway. Oh, it's so close to being done. And then to the right, this is sort of my dream configuration. Who knows if we'll have
Wait, what's the sheet?
sufficient fuel to do this here, but so the first question is basically what is causing time variations in the reconnection rate? If we observe these strongly fluctuating electric fields in the EDR, what's causing their growth? And so the point is, if you have this really tight electron scale tetrahedron, you either see one inflow, the EDR, or the other inflow, but you don't see all of them at the same time. So you need to space your spacecraft far enough apart that you can see the inflow and the EDR at the same time. So you can correlate the dynamics of the EDR with the associated input that you're getting, say, from the sheet. And so we're doing, just entering in a regular tetrahedron campaign now to address that first question of how the aspects of energy conversion and reconnection are affected by time variations in the sheath inflow. Then finally, number two, this is what I hope our orbital mechanics folks will tell us that we have sufficient fuel to do, is to start spacing the four MMS probes apart in the out of plane direction. So for instance, along the magnetopause, separated longitudinally, along the tail separated longitudinally. Basically, you want the four spacecraft blown apart along the X line or along the jets or something like that. And so the question is here, if you see some localization, is some localization, some local forces that are contributing to the electric field at an X point, which is the best description of the reconnection rate. How does that translate to the sort of gross output of your reconnection in terms of the sort of global reconnection rate, which is just the integration of your reconnection electric field along the entire X line? And how does it, how do fluctuations in your EDR impact, if they do at all, the overall sort of mass and flux transport rates? Now I'll wrap this up here. I hope I'm on time at least.
Yeah.
Sorry, you said 5?
Yeah, another 5 minutes or so, yeah.
Oh, okay, then I'll leave this up here and throw it open for questions if there are any.
Sure, let's first thank our speaker. Take questions from the room or online as well, if anybody wants to unmute. Questions for Kevin?
Weirdly formal to be giving a seminar.
Does the finite size of the current sheet along the guide field play any role here in terms of particles, let's say, leaving the,
That's a really good question that I wish I had an answer to.
I know it's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering in this particular setup, because in other situations like turbulence or the sun, it definitely does.
Yeah.
But is this maybe in the magneto sheath? I'm wondering, is that maybe the dimension is so large that it just doesn't affect that much the physics?
It very well could be. I'm gonna steal an analogy from a scientist at BU, Brian Walsh. He is describing a localization from reconnection on the ion scale. Basically, what he related it to was in simulations, you'll throw sort of a solid wall of magnetic fields against each other, but in reality, the magnetosheath plasma, for instance, is less like two sort of clean sheets of paper touching and making contact evenly, a crumpled piece of paper making contact at various discrete points, setting up what might fit your description as sort of inherent localization of the current sheet in the current direction. So it's not like there's this continuous uniformity in the current that would the scale and intensity of the turbulence in your inflow might set some localization that you'd eventually see in the resulting reconnection. That's certainly a possibility. Here in this simulation, we did what I described most simulations as doing, is just throwing solid walls. And the only thing was the solid walls of uniform magnetic field at each other. And the only thing we did was just at some point rotate the magnetic field. And that alone, without introducing any of our own spatial scale, resulted in this out of plane localization that you get from these oblique tearing modes that peel off. So it could be time or spatially imposed from the inflow.
Any other questions for Kevin? Anything online? Yeah, I have one question, actually, speaking again of the guide field situation. So just thinking of the role of E parallel and whether or not E parallel, I guess, is the reconnection electric field, if you have that strong guide field component as well. I guess like in the anti-parallel case, maybe you'd see kind of these quadrupolar E parallel structures more toward the exhaust and not really localized at the X line. But do we think, like, at least in guide field reconnection, E parallel is critical, I guess, to driving the reconnection? Like, is E parallel the reconnection electric field, I guess, in that case, or not necessarily?
X point of guide field reconnection.
Hmm.
The out of plane reconnection electric field is entirely parallel. So yes, yes, in the guide field case, the E parallel is critical.
So like 100% along the guide field, I guess. Yeah.
Which is very odd, because if you picture a magnetic field threading, you know, right through the center of a guide field X line, and you actually think your X line is very long, very large scale. The potential drop that you get along that field line is astronomically huge. So I would say yes, but also it's kind of odd if that it should be the case.
Yeah.
But that doesn't stop it from being odd.
Sure. Yes. Good. Okay. Well,
I was also wondering, in connection with this, how do you actually identify the location of the reconnection site from your data? Let's say you have your measurement of the magnetic field and the electric field. How do you identify where the reconnection is actually happening?
It's an extremely involved process. It's very hard to unambiguously separate a location of reconnection with a variety of other signatures. Typically, but not always, that involves identifying a reconnection electric field that is not ideal MHD, so non-vanishing in the electron convective frame. Often, but not always, you'll require some signature of electron pressure non-gyrotropy. What else? You need to either, you can do it in a variety of ways with a variety of complexities, but somehow reconstructing the three-dimensional magnetic field from 4 points of data with sufficient enough information to see that you have an X point somewhere near you. I could go on, but I won't.
Okay.
It's entire papers of, approaching 10 figures of data to firmly establish that you've seen one reconnection site.
And what about having multi-scale observations? That would help you.
I guess so. I mean, there's always the debate of what the EDR really is. I feel like, so I said people use the pressure non-gyrotropy to identify EDRs. Part of me thinks that the reason that we have so few high guide field EDRs is because probably there's a whole bunch more out there, but we're using pressure non-gyrotropy. And it turns out that might actually not be a great indicator of reconnection. So the multi-scale stuff could probably help you. Like you could at least place yourself at the center of an ion float reversal,
That's what I had.
for instance.
Yeah.
But there's always the question of whether or not you've hit an EDR, and that's a tough question to answer. 10 more years of MMS and we'll probably have a halfway decent answer that most people can agree on. Cool.
Okay, well, let's thank Kevin again.